What happens when a single academic argument suddenly turns into a global cultural battlefield? For Jordan Peterson, this was no longer theory. It was reality. The online lectures that once attracted a modest audience of students and curious thinkers began circulating far beyond the classroom. Millions of viewers, people from different countries, backgrounds, and beliefs, began watching his arguments unfold in real time. And almost overnight, he was no longer just a professor. He became a symbol. But a symbol of what exactly? To some, he represented intellectual resistance against enforced language and political conformity. To others, he represented something far more controversial, a challenge to evolving social norms that many believed were necessary for progress. And here is where the tension deepened. When does a philosophical disagreement stop being academic and start becoming cultural warfare? The comment sections, interviews, and debates turned into digital battlegrounds. Every sentence he spoke seemed to be dissected, analyzed, and interpreted through opposing lenses. But what does it do to a person when millions of strangers constantly project meaning onto your words, meaning you may not even intend? Behind the lectures and cameras, the pressure began to build. Not just intellectually, but personally. The weight of constant visibility. As his visibility increased, so did the demands on his time and attention. Speaking events, interviews, international travel, media appearances, it never seemed to stop. And beneath it all was something less visible but far more exhausting. The expectation to always respond. To always defend. To always explain. But can a human mind sustain that level of psychological pressure indefinitely? Friends and colleagues later described this period as one of intensity and acceleration. Every idea he expressed seemed to trigger another wave of reaction, support, anger, analysis, reinterpretation. It raises an uncomfortable question. At what point does public discourse stop being dialogue and start becoming consumption of a person? Because that is what Jordan Peterson was becoming to many people, not just a thinker, but a figure constantly consumed by attention. And attention, as it turns out, has a cost. The slow descent into exhaustion. As the years progressed, the pace did not slow down. If anything, it intensified. Behind the public image, there were quieter struggles, long work hours, emotional strain, and mounting exhaustion that was difficult to acknowledge openly. How does someone who spends their life analyzing chaos recognize when their own life is slowly slipping into it? For Peterson, the line between discipline and depletion began to blur. And then came the health crisis. A breaking point no one fully saw coming. In 2019 and into 2020, his condition deteriorated dramatically. What began as medical complications escalated into a prolonged and deeply challenging period of illness and recovery. He would later undergo treatment abroad, including intensive medical care in Russia, after severe reactions to prescribed medications and withdrawal complications. But beyond the clinical details, the deeper story was something more universal. What happens when the mind that built its identity on resilience is suddenly forced into complete physical vulnerability? For a man who had spent decades speaking about confronting suffering, this was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. It was unavoidable. And it stripped away every intellectual abstraction. There were no lectures in that moment. No debates. No audience. Only the body. Only fragility. Only uncertainty. The questions that no philosophy can answer. During this period, one question seemed to echo through everything his supporters and critics observed. Can understanding suffering actually protect you from it? Or does knowing more about human fragility simply make its experience even more intense? Another question followed closely behind. What happens when the mind remains aware, but the body begins to fail? For Peterson, recovery was not a straight line. It was slow, uncertain, and deeply personal. Reports of rehabilitation, rest, and gradual rebuilding of strength marked this period of withdrawal from public life. And yet, even in absence, his presence remained in public discourse. People debated his ideas, speculated about his condition, and waited for any sign of return. But perhaps the most important transformation was happening away from public attention. A forced confrontation with limitation. Return and reflection. When he eventually began reappearing publicly, there was something noticeably different in tone. Not a change in ideas, but in weight. The experience of illness had altered the way he spoke about suffering, not as a concept to analyze, but as a reality that cannot be escaped through intellect alone. And that leads to a final set of questions that his journey forces us to consider. If a lifetime of studying chaos does not shield you from it, then what does? Is meaning something we construct, or something we are forced to confront when everything else collapses? And perhaps most uncomfortably, do we truly understand life only when we are forced into moments where understanding no longer helps? Today, Jordan Peterson's story stands as more than the rise of a public intellectual. It has become a reminder that no amount of knowledge, discipline, or philosophical structure can fully shield a human being from the fragility of existence. Because at the end of everything, beneath ideology, beneath debate, beneath language itself, there is still the body. Still vulnerability. Still the quiet, brutal question that never fully goes away. What does it really mean to endure suffering, not as an abstract idea, but as a human being living through it? And maybe the deeper question is this: can a person become a symbol without eventually paying a price? Because Peterson did. The rise that never slowed down. After 2016, his life seemed to enter a permanent state of acceleration. What had once been the career of a professor and psychologist suddenly transformed into something far larger. Universities, interviews, global tours, lecture halls, podcasts, media debates, and public appearances stacked one on top of another until his schedule looked less like a life and more like a machine that never turned off. Everywhere he went, people wanted something from him. Some came to listen. Some came to challenge him. Some came to criticize him. Others came because they felt he had given words to feelings they had never been able to explain. He was no longer just a man speaking in classrooms. He had become a cultural figure, a lightning rod, a voice for some, an enemy for others. Then came 2018, when he released 12 Rules for Life, a book that exploded into global success almost instantly. It was not just read, it was absorbed, discussed, quoted, defended, and attacked. Millions connected with its emphasis on responsibility, order, and personal discipline. For many, it felt like someone had finally put words to the struggle of trying to live with purpose in a chaotic world. But what happens when success leaves no room for rest? What happens when a life built on public demand starts consuming the private self beneath it? Behind the acclaim, the pressure was building. Travel became constant. Expectations kept rising. Every appearance invited more scrutiny. Every statement sparked more reaction. There was no quiet space left where he could simply be a man, rather than a figure being watched, judged, and interpreted. And beneath all of that, there was no pause button. During this period, he also adopted a highly restrictive diet centered almost entirely on meat, which he believed supported his health and mental clarity. For some, this seemed like another example of his intense self-discipline. For others, it seemed extreme. But maybe that is what made the situation so revealing. When does discipline become survival? And when does survival begin to look like confinement? Because sometimes what looks like strength from the outside is actually a narrowing path on the inside. A person can build structure around themselves so tightly that there is barely any room left to recover. 2019, when everything became personal. While public life intensified, Peterson was struck by something far more painful at home. His wife, Tammy, was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive kidney cancer. That changes everything. Because once illness enters the family, philosophy is no longer just philosophy. Ideas about suffering, courage, and meaning stop sounding distant. They become immediate, intimate, unavoidable. What does it mean to speak about responsibility when someone you love is suddenly fighting for their life? What does strength look like when the person closest to you is facing a battle that no amount of intellect can solve? At the same time, Peterson's own mental health began to break down under the pressure. Anxiety increased. Sleep became unstable. Stress accumulated. The public could still see a man speaking with intensity and precision, but what they could not see was the internal toll of trying to hold too much together at once. He was eventually prescribed clonazepam, a medication intended to help stabilize him through a period of crisis. At first, it may have seemed like one more tool to help him function through overwhelming stress. But dependence can develop quietly. Not all collapse announces itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives as routine. Sometimes it hides inside the very thing meant to provide relief. And that is where the story changes. From public controversy to private collapse. From debate to vulnerability. From the impression of control to the reality of a body that can no longer be reasoned with. The collapse few people understood. Withdrawal from benzodiazepines is not gentle. It is not graceful. It is often severe, destabilizing, and deeply dangerous. When Peterson attempted to stop the medication, his body reacted violently. The symptoms intensified. Anxiety became extreme. Neurological distress followed. Normal functioning became nearly impossible. Sleep, clarity, balance, and stability all became harder to hold on to. How does a person think clearly when their nervous system is in revolt? How does someone known for structure endure a period where structure itself begins to disappear? Doctors struggled to stabilize him. The situation became increasingly difficult to manage. Eventually, his family sought treatment in Russia, where he underwent an induced coma, a rare and high-risk intervention designed to help control the withdrawal process more safely. Let that sink in for a moment. What does it mean when the treatment itself becomes more extreme than the condition? What does it say about the severity of a crisis when conventional paths are no longer enough? During this time, he also developed pneumonia, adding yet another layer to an already dangerous medical situation. The outcome was uncertain. There was no guarantee that things would resolve cleanly. There was no promise that he would simply return to life as it was before. Even survival was not certain. And maybe that is the part people struggle with most. Not just that suffering happened, but that it happened to someone whose entire public identity had been built around the struggle to order human chaos. Suddenly, the man who had spoken so often about confronting pain was confronting pain in the most literal way possible. Not as a metaphor. As a body in crisis. As a life hanging in balance. 2020. A fragile return. When Peterson eventually re-emerged publicly, it was immediately clear that this was not the same man who had once dominated lecture halls and interviews with relentless force. He looked thinner. Weaker. His speech and movement were slower. The intensity had not vanished, but it seemed buried beneath exhaustion. There was still a mind at work, still a voice with conviction, but now it carried the marks of injury. So what happens when a thinker known for strength is forced to rebuild himself from physical fragility? What happens when the person who spent years telling others to stand up straight must himself learn how to stand again? In conversations with his daughter, he spoke openly about the ordeal. The tone was not polished. It was not carefully packaged for the public. It felt raw, unsettled, and human. That rawness mattered, because it showed a side of suffering that cannot be edited into a clean narrative. At the same time, something unexpected happened. His wife's cancer began to improve beyond expectations. It was a reversal of fortune that no one could have planned and no one could easily explain. In a story dominated by pain, that change introduced a fragile thread of relief. Not victory exactly. Not resolution. But the possibility that suffering does not always move in one direction forever. And perhaps that is the only reason people keep going. Because even in the middle of collapse, something can still shift. Rebuilding after breakdown. In 2021, Peterson released Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. The book arrived in a different emotional climate than his earlier work. If 12 Rules for Life felt like a framework built from confidence and philosophical urgency, Beyond Order felt more cautious, more reflective, and more aware of how easily life can break apart. It was not simply a sequel. It felt like a response to pain. A way of asking, after order is shattered, what then? How do you keep going after the very systems that helped you survive are no longer enough? Soon afterward, he left his tenured position at the University of Toronto. For some, this looked like a sharp transition. For others, it looked like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. But maybe it was both. Was it an ending? Or was it reinvention? In the years that followed, he moved further into independent platforms and digital education initiatives, attempting to reconstruct a life that had been forced apart by health, family crisis, and public scrutiny. That kind of rebuilding is rarely dramatic. It is usually quiet, inconsistent, and slow. It happens in the spaces between obligations, in the pauses between setbacks, in the long effort of trying to become functional again. But stability, as life keeps proving, is never permanent. 2025. A new invisible threat. Years later, another health crisis emerged. This time, it came from something most people would never suspect. While helping clean a family property, Peterson was exposed to toxic mold. What followed was the development of chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS, a condition in which the immune system remains stuck in a state of overactivation. What does it mean when the body no longer knows how to turn recovery back on? What happens when the system meant to protect you becomes trapped in its own alarm? His condition escalated quickly. Pneumonia followed, and then sepsis, a life-threatening bloodstream infection. Once again, hospitalization became necessary. Once again, intensive care returned to the center of the story. And just when it seemed that stabilization might be possible, neurological complications appeared, including polyneuropathy, which affected movement and strength. Once again, his body was no longer fully under his control. Once again, the old idea of simply pushing through was no longer enough. And perhaps that is the hardest lesson of all. Some forms of suffering do not care how disciplined you are. They do not negotiate. They do not reward intellect. They do not care how carefully your life has been arranged. They simply arrive. Recovery without guarantees. Even after leaving the hospital, recovery remained uncertain. There was no smooth return to normal life, no clean ending, no final chapter where everything fell neatly back into place. Instead, there was gradual, uneven progress. Some days were better. Others brought setbacks. Each improvement seemed to come with a reminder that healing is not always linear. So what does recovery look like when it does not follow a timeline? What does it mean to heal when there is no promise that you will become who you once were? Family support became essential. Daily life slowed. Public engagement faded into the background. The pace of existence changed. And that change itself became part of the story. For someone who built much of his public identity around responsibility, control, and endurance, this period must have forced a deeply personal confrontation with limitation. Willpower can do a great deal. Discipline can do a great deal. But biology, at times, has the final word. And that realization is humbling. Not because it defeats meaning, but because it reveals where meaning actually lives. Not in control alone. Not in certainty. But in the act of continuing, even when certainty is gone. Conclusion. A life still unfolding. Jordan Peterson's journey is no longer only about ideas, controversy, or influence. It has become something far more human. A reminder that even the most articulate minds are not immune to physical fragility. That success does not protect against suffering. That public strength does not cancel private vulnerability. And that meaning is often tested most severely not in theory, but in lived experience. So perhaps the real question is not about Peterson himself. Perhaps it is about us. What would we do when everything we built our identity on was suddenly taken away? How would we respond if the body betrayed the mind? Would our beliefs survive contact with real suffering? And more importantly, what remains when only endurance is left? Maybe that is the quietest and most difficult truth in this entire story, that a human life is not measured by how untouched it remains, but by how it continues after being wounded. And maybe that is why Peterson's story resonates so strongly. Not because it is perfect, not because it is tidy, but because it exposes something every person eventually has to face. No matter how much we know, no matter how much we prepare, no matter how carefully we build our lives, we remain human. And being human means this. We break. We endure. We try again. And sometimes, against all expectation, that is enough.